Time and time again, we experience various types of games with different elements that give a distinct outlook after completion, as we usually compare and rate every game we come across based on its mechanics and overall playtime. These days, the average video game can take up from a few to a whopping 100 plus hours to complete with one playthrough, although what exactly is fair to the modern game today? I'm the Old Tin Man, and if you're new to my channel, consider subscribing to find more videos like this one. I'll make your YouTube newsfeed a happier place. Thank you everyone for watching. There are a lot of aspects that contribute to the length of a game. One in particular is the game's developer. When it comes to developing a game, it's important to consider the company's time constraints, the budget, and overall manpower to complete the project. In the end, the developer is the one who decides how long the game will actually be. If you look at a smaller game such as Castle Crashers, the game developer, the Behemoth, only had 9 people to work on that game. Taking into account the brilliant artwork and excellent transitions between each level made the 8 hours completely worth the time. Indie developers are influenced in making a simple game have distinguishing elements that places it on a different level from AAA games. As these developers don't have the resources of a AAA studio, they work with what they have. Most indie games usually run around 1 to 10 hours, which is an understandable length as the game makes an uncommon way of getting to the point. Most game developers recognize what the ideal length of their games should be after reviewing their audience's impressions of their past titles. Once a developer finds the perfect length, they usually tend to keep that prior length for future projects. Telltale Games, developer of the award-winning Walking Dead series, usually aims for the length of 10 hours for their games, while the Kojima Productions team early work on Metal Gear Solid was an average of 15 to 20 hours. An interesting element that Telltale Games utilizes in their games is merging their work into multiple episodes, like a TV show, usually running at 2 hours each segment. This is becoming more and more popular now as it attracts a wider audience that usually just don't play games. But the game length can change for future games over time. We will talk more about this later in the video. Each game genre differentiates from one another, as the player expects a certain amount of hours for a given genre. For instance, there are games that are linear, which will have a set play time. Games like this include Heavy Rain or the Uncharted series. A majority of these games are linked to a story-based genre like action-adventure or horror, and usually consist a good 15 hours of playtime, allowing the player to experience an intriguing story without lingering too long. But there are games that have a non-linear path, which have more of an exploration and sense of control of the direction, such as the Fallout series and the later GTA games. Having more control on what to do next gives a much longer time frame, but in the end the game will conclude just like linear games. However, there are games such as Cities Skylines, The Sims, and Minecraft that have a higher replayability genre with no particular direction or expected finishing point. These sandbox and simulation games will have a broad playtime, usually depending on the player's motivation to continue, which can be nearly hundreds of hours. The genre that usually has a more extensive playtime than any other genre besides sandbox games are RPG titles. When it comes to games such as Final Fantasy, Elder Scrolls, and Mass Effect, we can find a length of 150 hours. With this much time, we calculate the amount of time we have been building the protagonist, customizing our party skills, and completing side quests, along with the core game. RPG games juggle a lot of different elements to the player, but are generally introduced at different portions of the game. For example, I'm currently playing Persona 5 at the 25-hour mark, and the game has presented a great portion of content. At this point, I would be a quarter of the way through the game, and I've only touched a fragment of its mechanics. This game, along with many others, unlocks certain portions of the game the more the player progresses. RPGs present a great amount to the player as this genre focuses on a strategic theme, and it cannot simply allow the player to have complete freedom without confusing the player. In Persona 5, it took me 5 hours to get to the point where I can finally explore the city around me. Instead of this being a restriction of the game's core, it feels like the game is including you to a universe that you're unaware of, so you can master every aspect of it. 150 hours might seem like you're getting more for your money, rather than something with 15 hours, especially if they are the same price, although this is determined on who is playing the game, as bigger is not always better. 100 hours might be a monstrous amount to someone who enjoys a casual game, or a game that relies heavily on developing a plot and its characters. As for myself, one of my favorite games is The Last of Us with 16 hours. Nevertheless, I love surrendering my life to an elaborate title, such as Persona 5 with over 100 hours. The difference is the amount of satisfaction we receive from each. We don't see a linear game lasting 150 hours without a moment of a break. A game with that extent could take a considerably long time to develop, and would be nearly impossible to make a massive story that connects to a single goal. Think of the story in a game like a plot from a movie. There are 3 acts: the setup of the plot, the confrontation between the protagonist and their goal, and the conclusion containing the climax and resolution. Imagine these acts stretched by 10 times its standard time limit. The output would feel dull and endless. This is what sequels are designed for, to continue the story and make a deeper connection to the characters. With a sequel, the game can change its theme, point of interest, in addition to a newer game mechanic that could replace a failed one in a previous game. When we advance through something like technology, we always find improvements with simplified environments, especially with video games. The game industry has been tweaking game systems and the games that come with them. What does this mean for the length of video games in the future? Let's take a look at the first console created, Magnavox Odyssey, a brown box that displayed a few white boxes on the screen, which resulted Pong-style games. These games outputted a good few hours at a time, but nothing like the investment we put into our games today. Although we see a change in game length over time, we don't typically see a drastic change in its length. For instance, The Order 1886, a game significantly known for its shortness and length. The game unfortunately didn't succeed with its 7-hour story that consisted large amounts of cutscenes and failed as an experiment. The Order just didn't match the length of any other game at the time of its release. The game length is an important factor when publishing it to an audience that expects a certain level of compromise. Think of the amount of time we put into TV shows, as there's televised shows now that only push out 7 episodes per season in this newer generation, unlike the larger portion we were used to in older shows. The entire entertainment business constantly changes to match their audience better. As shows are shaping to be more simplified, it makes me think of the remake for Square Enix's Final Fantasy VII. It was announced that this title is being split into 3 games over a period of time. For most, this might seem like a newer format for games that could run past the 100-hour mark, allowing the publisher to sell more. Square Enix explains that they plan on the 3 games to have a different experience each, but would this mini-series live up to the original? The Final Fantasy series is an RPG series after all, with each game generally lasting a strong 30 to 40 hours. Will we find that same game length with the new Final Fantasy VII Remake? It's hard to say if we will see future games with a shorter length and time, but I think that is really up for us to decide. So what exactly is fair to our modern game? It all comes down to the game's content and how it catches the player's attention. The length should be determined on how much is being offered to the player at any given time. Not all games are great, but it's important to understand that the game length plays an important part in appealing to its audience. Could we also see a change in the length of games over time? It's hard to say, as we will only see for ourselves. Thank you for watching the video, and consider subscribing to see more analysis videos. Let me know in the comments if you want to see any other analysis on a specific game mechanic or element. Find me on the social medias, where I can tell you bedtime stories that usually conclude with the protagonist dying. You're welcome. Thank you again, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you.